With that, we turn to Madame Gallant.
General Leslie, under the most severe circumstances, if Canada does not fill the blind spot with our satellites, install air defense in the far north, patrol the Arctic waters, and the U.S. feels threatened and exposed, what will the Americans do to protect our continent's northern flank?
There's an old saying, which is sometimes true, which is sovereignty has to be seen to be effective. And in our case, our sovereign troops deployed in the Arctic, through no fault of their own, due to lack of equipment, lack of numbers, lack of training, lack of resources, which boils down to taxpayer money, has resulted in, from a Canadian perspective, our Arctic is undefended. So the more that the Americans get used to the idea of they have to secure and defend it for us, it's logical to assume that they may well look to some sort of economic compensation from the resources in that Arctic, which Canadians, it's hard to find any Canadian who doesn't admire the beauty, the pristine nature of our Arctic. But we have to spend time, money, and effort to make sure it remains ours with our friends and allies.
Former NATO Parliamentary Assembly President and senior member of the Armed Services Committee, now chair of the House Permanent Select Committee on Intelligence, Congressman Mike Turner recently wrote an op-ed in Newsweek entitled "Trudeau, Not Trump, is the Greatest Threat to NATO." Why does the DPU evoke such a sense of non-confidence from our greatest ally?
Canada spends a considerable amount on the bigger picture defense issues. And as you're well aware, in 2017, NATO changed the rules wherein a whole host of issues ancillary to the business of fighting and winning the nation's wars were counted as defense spending. Veterans, pensions, some of the support agencies, and the list goes on. What we have to do is question the output for the Canadian investment in defense. And output is a variety of many factors. It includes well-trained, fit, capable men and women who are willing to go overseas and do dangerous things on our behalf. They have to have the right equipment, they have to have the right facilities, they have to have the right training infrastructure and the money to buy ammo. And by the way, how's that ammo contract going? I'm sorry, I'm asking you a question. That's unfair. So, we are not getting the bang for our buck. And why is that? Well, if you have a nation that spends more on professional services and consultants than it does on the Army, Navy, and Air Force combined, if you have a nation which has increased its public servant by over 40% since 2015 at now a staggering cost, if you have essentially a defense procurement system which is arguably amongst the very worst in the world for the purchase of big stuff like combat equipment, aircraft, ships, submarines. And by the way, the evidence is irrefutable. There is no evidence of the current government actually buying a large, complex, modern weapons system in the last decade.
Okay, so what programs and initiatives is this government trying to nickel and dime our CAFs that's limiting their operational capability and effectiveness? I believe you referred to that in the National Post.
Essentially, the armed forces is short anywhere between 13,000 to 16,000 people. And to address that shortfall is at least an additional $1 billion per year just for the personnel costs. On top of that, you have the basic and advanced training requirements. Because of the lack of progress on any of the major weapon systems needed to allow our people to survive contemporary warfare, especially as the way that the warfare examples that we have in Ukraine are showing new technologies are required, plus a whole bunch of the older ones, our armed forces are woefully inequipped, and that bow wave of equipment acquisition is what's causing the government to step back from announcing, for example, a contract for the ammunition systems, for the ships, for the planes, and it goes on, for the tanks.
You also said that about 72% of the Army's vehicles and trailers are offline. Do most of these vehicles need maintenance, or do they need to be replaced entirely?
Mr. Chair, both. Thank you for that question. So a whole bunch of this stuff is old. That which is not necessarily old doesn't have the spare parts to make sure that they can run adequately, especially when you use them for advanced training, where vehicles tend to get beaten up a bit. What is needed in this particular instance is a threefold increase. One, for additional mechanics and people who can service those vehicles. Two is for the ammunition to actually allow the systems to train, and the gas and the spare parts. And And the third is the people to actually man the equipment, because with more people, you reduce the individual stresses and workloads, which has contributed to a higher attrition rate.
Are the troops we have in Latvia properly equipped and with proper vehicles, should that become a hot zone?
No, they're not properly equipped. They are doing the best with that which they have. They have the Leopard 2 tanks. They've got now a nascent air defense system for short range, but none for medium or long. They don't have an exhaustive drone suite. They don't have the articulated and dispersed command and control architectures that a modern soldier needs to survive in the battlefield, and I could go on. The armed forces are doing the best with what they have, but it's the lack of defense acquisition and essentially willingness of this government to spend money on the troops.
Of the 72 vehicles that are offline, can you break down which vehicle types are the most prevalent to be inoperable?
Currently, the vehicle types which are mostly broken are the ones you need the most when you go to war or when you want to deter Russians from advancing into Latvia. That's tanks, armored personnel carriers, light armored vehicles, artillery systems, mortar, target acquisition radars, and of course the command and control architecture is really 25 years old.